faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane. No, it's Superman. Yes, Superman, strange visitor from another planet who came to Earth with powers far beyond those of mortal men. Superman, who can change the course of mighty rivers, bend steel in his bare hands, and who, disguised as Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. There's a new movie coming out. Man of Steel. And for those of us who are old enough at least to remember the reruns of that old Superman show in black and white, this is probably the fourth or fifth retelling of the Superman saga, that great comic book saga that we have seen, if you count the last TV show, Smallville. We love superhero stories and movies. They feed a need we have to hear of someone who achieved greatness. They inspire us. They make us feel like maybe we can be more than we think we are. They're also just plain fun. And as I've taught our kids, mostly on our shore trip in a couple of the years past, these stories are largely rooted in the religious story of the hero. Superman is largely molded from the Greek tale of Hercules. Krypton is Olympia. Jor-El, his dad, is largely modeled after Zeus. Both of them are raised by earthly parents, and both have quests that involve figuring out who they are, but also involve saving the world. Every religion has hero stories, stories designed to inspire faith, but stories that are also just plain fun to tell around the campfire. And for the Jewish people, Elijah was it. Elijah was the Jewish Superman, even as his powers don't involve a lot of heavy lifting. Elijah's the one who was miraculously fed by ravens in the wilderness. He multiplies food and saves himself and a widow's family in a time of drought. In the story we read from last week, he's the one who calls on God to bring fire down from the heavens to consume a sacrifice in a big contest against his arch-enemies, the prophets of Baal. Elijah even uses fire from heaven to consume some of his enemies. Oh, and if you want to make Elijah Batman, his Robin, Elisha, he does a lot of cool stuff too. The hero fills a need in us, and for the Jewish people, the hero was a sign that God was present, God was powerful, and God reigned among them. And that's why with Jesus, we see the miracles of Elijah and Elisha and others come around again. Jesus, by doing the things that Elijah and Elisha did, was ringing a bell in the spirits of the Jewish people. He was sending them a signal that God was present, God was powerful, and that God could bring hope and life out of the most hopeless situation. And it didn't get a lot more hopeless than it was on this day. Jesus comes into the town and he sees a funeral procession for a young man. And his mother, a widow, is mourning the death of her only son, but it's even more than that. You see, her darkness is more than just the darkness of deep grief. Her darkness is the darkness of realizing that, in many ways, her life was over. Because she was a widow. She couldn't go out and get a job. She couldn't handle the family finances. She was going to watch as her home and her possessions were given to the oldest surviving male relative. And then she had to hope that she would be taken into that relative's house, not as mistress of the house, but just as a woman who was very dependent on the kindness of her new master. Or it could be even worse. So, this darkness was really darkness. The darkness of deep grief, but also the darkness of knowing that her life, or at least the life she had known, would never be the same again. We've all probably had times like that. We've all probably had a time when it seemed like the earth was just going to drop out from below our feet. A time when the next breath we were going to take seemed difficult. The time when maybe we couldn't have a whole lot of faith because it just felt like God had abandoned us. And that's her darkness. God had not interceded for her. Her prayers for mercy, her prayers for life, her prayers for healing had failed. And now she was alone with her darkness. And Jesus, in an act that mirrors that hero's story from Elijah you just heard read, comes in to the town, walks into this funeral procession, and he says, "Woman, don't weep." And then he walks over to the bier and he puts his hand on it and says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." No explanation, no introductions. This strange guy from out of town just walks into the middle of the funeral procession, and the next thing you know, the young guy is sitting up and talking, and everyone around, every one of those Jewish people there, felt a surge in their heart, a cry in their heart, a cry of wonderment and fear and joy. And that cry was, Elijah. God has brought us a new prophet, a new hero. Only this time, through the Holy Spirit, the hero would never leave. Through the waters of baptism, through the miracle of the presence of Christ at the table, through the Holy Spirit that fills us in our prayer and unites us in our community, in the power and the promise of resurrection when earthly healing does not occur, Jesus would always be there and is always there. You know, maybe the most important point of this story is this. Jesus knows what she needs. He doesn't ask a whole lot. He doesn't say anything. He just says, "Don't weep." He doesn't talk with her about her faith. But you know, there are about 30 healings in Luke, and talk about faith only occurs in a handful of them. Now, that's not saying faith isn't important. I'm not too sure anything's more important than faith. But what it's saying is that Jesus comes and brings this gift of God, this gift of healing, and gives it out of love freely. It's a sign to us of God's care for us, a sign of God's intimate understanding of us, a sign of God's willingness to reach down to us when life has beaten us down so far we just can't reach up anymore. I spent way too much time at Synod Assembly this week. Those of you who really know me know that's not my favorite place to go. And I do have to tell you, as you sit in Synod Assembly and you hear all that news, some of what I've talked to you about in past weeks comes through. the ELCA, like an awful lot of other churches, is a church on a buyer. But we have to remember, Jesus is standing right next to us, and Jesus is saying, get up. And we have. We've gotten up. Now we got to keep on walking. We also got ourselves, as I mentioned earlier, a new bishop. And I want to tell you something about him. He believes these words. He believes this church will rise. And we got to help him. We got to help him. Because we need to be an example to those churches who are looking at the days ahead and not believing they can get out of that grave. May Christ grant us the Spirit to be such an example. May God grant us the light of Christ. And may that light of Christ abate all the darkness in this world.